The morning began quietly, the kind of calm that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen. The sky was soft and pale, the air cool enough to feel fresh, and the road ahead seemed simple. She walked steadily, holding the baby close, whispering little sounds to keep the child calm. The world felt slow and peaceful, almost like it was watching over them. She had made this trip many times before, but today felt different in a way she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the stillness, or maybe it was the way the wind kept shifting, as if carrying a warning she couldn't hear clearly. She wasn't running from anything. Not at that moment. She was just a woman trying to reach a safer place, hoping the small child in her arms would grow up somewhere quieter than the life she had known. She dreamed of a future where the baby could laugh freely, without fear echoing in the background. These thoughts filled her mind as she walked, comforting her, steadying her. She tightened her hold around the child, feeling the soft breaths against her chest, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine that everything would turn out fine. The countryside lay open around them, empty fields, distant hills, a gravel road stretching forward. It was the kind of landscape where sound traveled far, where you could hear something coming long before it reached you. But today there was nothing to hear. No engines, no footsteps, no voices, just the quiet rhythm of her own breathing and the gentle rustle of the baby shifting in her arms. She glanced around from time to time, out of habit more than fear. Nothing moved. No danger, no shadows creeping closer. Just the wind sliding through the grass and the rustling leaves far off in the trees. It should have comforted her, but the silence felt heavier than usual, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself she was tired, that her mind was playing small tricks. There was no reason to worry. Not yet. Still, she walked a little faster as though something inside her whispered to keep moving. She didn't know why. She didn't see anything. But deep down, she felt that peace this perfect never lasted long. And without realizing it, she held the child just a little closer, as if preparing for something she couldn't name. She had taken only a few more steps when the world she knew shattered. It didn't begin with a scream or a warning. It began with a sound so sharp and sudden that it felt like the air itself cracked in half. A single gunshot. It echoed across the open land, bouncing off the quiet hills and slamming into her chest with invisible force. She froze for a second, her heart pounding, unsure if she had imagined it. But then came another shot and another, closer this time, louder, unmistakable. Someone was firing, and they were firing in her direction. Instinct took over before she even fully understood what was happening. She lowered her body, clutching the baby tightly against her chest. The child stirred at the noise, letting out a soft whimper, but she pressed her hand gently over its back, trying to soothe it, trying to keep it quiet. Her breath came fast, her mind spinning, but somewhere inside her, a sharp voice whispered one command: move. She turned her head slowly, scanning the road behind her. Dust rose in the distance, shifting like smoke. At first it seemed harmless, just part of the dry path. But then she saw them, figures small at first, then growing clearer as they approached with quick, determined steps. They weren't travelers. They weren't strangers passing through. They were armed, and they were coming straight toward her. A cold wave passed through her body. She didn't know exactly why they were after her, but she knew enough. She had seen them before, heard their threats, understood the danger they carried with them. And now they had found her. Her stomach tightened as the truth sank in. This wasn't random. They had come for her, and they would not hesitate to harm the baby to get what they wanted. The men shouted something she couldn't fully make out. Their voices were harsh, carried by the wind in broken pieces. But she understood the tone: angry, demanding, relentless. A warning shot hit the ground near her feet, sending gravel flying. She flinched, stumbling backward, her grip tightening around the small child. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. She turned and ran. Her feet hit the ground hard as she sprinted toward the tree line ahead. The forest stood like a dark wall, thick and tangled, but it was the only chance she had. The open road offered no protection, no place to hide. The trees might slow her, but they would slow the attackers too. She held the baby close, praying silently that the child wouldn't cry, wouldn't make a sound. Her heart hammered in her ears, drowning out everything except the pounding of her steps and the rush of panic pushing her forward. Another gunshot rang out, closer, sharper. A bullet struck a tree beside her, sending bark exploding across her shoulder. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Fear clawed at her throat, but she shoved it down, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other. Run. Run harder. Don't stop. The forest swallowed her in its shadows as she crossed the first line of pines. Branches whipped her face and arms, but she kept going. Behind her, the voices grew louder. The men had followed. She could hear their boots crunching leaves, breaking twigs. They were spreading out, closing in, hoping to trap her between thickets and roots. She ducked behind a fallen log, crouching low for a moment to catch her breath. The baby squirmed, sensing her fear, and she pressed its head gently against her shoulder. "SHH," she whispered, barely audible even to herself. "I've got you, I promise." But promises meant nothing if she couldn't keep moving. She heard footsteps too close. One of the men shouted to another, telling him to check the left side of the trail. They were splitting up, sweeping the woods. The crack of branches told her they were fanning out wider. If she stayed still, they would find her. If she moved too fast, they would hear her. Every choice felt like a trap. She pulled herself up silently, wincing at the ache in her legs, and crept deeper into the forest. The ground here was uneven, covered in roots that twisted like ropes. She nearly tripped twice, but managed to steady herself each time. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. She didn't dare let fear make her careless. The voices drifted in and out behind her. Sometimes they were close enough that she could hear their harsh breathing. Sometimes they faded, making her wonder if she'd finally slipped away, or if they were simply circling ahead to cut her off. Every sound made her shoulders tense. Every shadow looked like a figure about to step out and grab her. She kept walking, one slow, careful step after another. Her hands were trembling, but she didn't loosen her grip on the baby. Nothing mattered more than keeping the child safe. She would endure anything for that small life held against her chest, even gunfire, even freezing cold, even death if she had no other choice. Another shout echoed through the trees, then another. They had found tracks, her tracks. Her throat tightened. She forced herself forward, veering off the faint path she'd been following. She pushed through a cluster of bushes, ignoring the sting of thorns catching her clothes. The forest grew denser, the air colder, the light dimmer. The ground sloped downward, making each step more dangerous. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. A bullet tore through the leaves above her, showering her with fragments. She gasped, almost stumbling. They weren't just chasing now. They were aiming with deadly intent. Her chest tightened with panic, but her determination burned even hotter. She kept moving, scrambling over rocks, slipping on damp soil, pushing her body past the point of pain. Her legs shook, her lungs burned, but she didn't slow. All she could think about was the child in her arms, the soft warmth, the tiny breaths, the innocent life depending completely on her. Behind her, the men kept shouting. Gunshots kept cracking through the air. And even though fear pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't lift, she refused to stop running. Not while the baby was still alive. Not while she still had strength left in her body. Not while they were still behind her, hunting her through the cold, merciless woods. She moved deeper into the forest, letting instinct guide her more than sight. The trees stood tall and crowded, their branches tangled above her like a rough ceiling. The world grew darker with every step, the sunlight swallowed by dense leaves and thick pine needles. She could hear her own breathing now, each breath sharp and uneven, but she forced herself to keep going. The baby shifted in her arms, a small reminder of the life she was carrying, the life she had promised to protect no matter what. The ground beneath her feet softened into damp soil. Moss spread across fallen logs. Roots twisted everywhere, threatening to catch her ankles if she wasn't careful. She had to slow her pace, not because she wanted to, but because the forest wouldn't allow anything else. Each step had to be placed deliberately, quietly. Leaves crackled under her boots, and she winced every time the noise seemed too loud. The men behind her weren't close enough to see her yet, but she knew they were still searching, sweeping the woods like predators tracking wounded prey. She pushed deeper, weaving between trunks, letting her fingers brush the rough bark to steady herself. Every few steps, she paused and listened. Sometimes she heard only the wind. Sometimes the distant snap of branches reminded her that the danger had not passed. She felt the cold creeping in again, whispering through the trees, slipping through the thin fabric of her clothes. But the cold didn't stop her. Fear didn't stop her. The baby's soft breathing against her chest gave her strength she didn't know she had. A fallen tree stretched across her path, blocking the way like a barricade. She hesitated for a second, staring at it, deciding whether to go over or around. Her legs trembled, already strained from running, and climbing over would risk a slip, too loud, too dangerous. She eased herself to the side, stepping carefully between thick roots and the base of the trunk. Her shoulder brushed the bark, and bits of decaying wood crumbled away, scattering softly onto the ground. The baby stirred again, letting out a faint, sleepy sound. She froze instantly, pressing her lips to the child's forehead. "Please," she whispered. "Not now, please." She waited, heart thudding painfully, until the baby settled. Only then did she continue. The forest thickened even more ahead. The trees grew closer, forming tight clusters that almost touched each other. Bushes rose in mounds, thorny and unforgiving. She slipped between them, allowing branches to scratch her arms because the alternative, turning back or finding a clearer route, was unthinkable. Behind her, the shouts grew fainter, but she knew better than to trust that. Men like them didn't give up easily, not when they believed they were close to what they wanted. What they wanted her. Or more specifically, the baby she carried. The thought made her stomach twist with dread. She didn't know how long she'd be able to stay ahead of them, but she had to try. She had to give the baby a chance, even if it cost her everything. A sudden rustling noise made her spin around. She crouched low, hugging the baby tight, scanning the shadows between the trees. The rustling came again just a few feet behind her. Something moved, but she couldn't see what it was. A deer, maybe, or a squirrel, or them. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out every other sound. After a long, tense moment, the forest fell quiet again. She exhaled slowly and turned back around, pushing forward with renewed urgency. Her breath came out in delicate clouds, fading quickly in the cooling air. The deeper she went, the colder it became. The trees blocked the sun almost completely now, and the wind slipped through the branches with a low, haunting whistle. The temperature dropped enough for her fingers to numb slightly. She switched the baby to her other arm, rubbing her free hand against her clothes to warm it, but it didn't help much. Still, she didn't complain, didn't slow. The cold only meant she had to move faster. A stream appeared ahead, its surface dark and rippling as it wound through the forest. The water looked icy and deep enough to be dangerous. She crouched near the bank, trying to look across to the opposite side. If she crossed, she could break her trail. But the current was quick and the rocks beneath looked slick with moss. One wrong move and they would both fall in. She took a few deep breaths, weighing the decision. The voices behind her were too distant to pinpoint, but she knew they were searching every direction. Staying on this side of the stream meant leaving clear footprints. Crossing meant risking the baby's safety in another way. She stared at the water, her jaw tense, then stepped back. No, not here. Not with the current this strong. She continued along the stream, staying close but not too close, searching for a safer point. The ground sloped downward sharply, and she had to lean back slightly to keep her balance. She felt her ankles wobble, but she steadied herself quickly. Her grip tightened around the baby until her hand ached. A branch cracked somewhere to her right. This time she didn't hesitate. She ducked behind a cluster of tall shrubs, lowering herself as much as possible without disturbing the baby. Her breath caught in her throat. She listened. Boots. She was sure of it. Heavy, careful steps trying to be quiet. That meant they were close again, far closer than she'd hoped. She held her breath, afraid even the sound of exhaling might give her away. The footsteps paused. The forest held its silence like a secret. Then the boots moved again, fading slowly, heading in a different direction. She waited several long minutes before forcing herself to rise. Her legs felt weak, shaking beneath her, but she pushed forward again because stopping would mean surrender. The baby let out a faint cry, barely a sound, but to her ears it felt loud enough to echo. She rocked the child gently, swaying even as she walked. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you." The forest stretched endlessly ahead, and she didn't know where she would go next. She only knew she had to keep moving, keep searching for a place where they couldn't follow, a place where she could rest for even a moment. The world behind her was filled with danger. The world ahead was unknown. But she stepped toward that unknown anyway, driven by the tiny heartbeat pressed against her chest. Night crept into the forest slowly, but with a weight that felt almost deliberate. The light faded until the world around her turned into shifting shapes and dark outlines. The trees, once tall and protective, now looked like shadows waiting to swallow her whole. The temperature dropped sharply, sinking into her bones, reaching her hands and feet first. She felt it settling in her skin like a bitter reminder that she was running out of time. The baby gave a small, shivering whimper against her chest, and she tightened her hold, trying to keep every inch of the child warm with her own body heat. Her breaths turned into pale clouds that rose and disappeared quickly in the icy air. Every inhale stung her lungs. Every exhale felt like giving away a piece of the warmth she needed to survive. She rubbed the baby's back through the fabric, moving her hand in slow circles to keep the child calm. The forest around her grew silent, too silent. No insects, no birds, no distant rustle of animals. Only the wind slithering between branches and her own uneven breathing breaking the stillness. Her legs ached from hours of running and stumbling. A heavy fatigue settled into her muscles, making each step harder than the last. Her ankle throbbed where she had twisted it earlier, but she didn't dare stop. She leaned against a tree for a moment, closing her eyes as the weight in her arms pulled at her tired shoulders. Her fingers felt stiff, almost numb, as she adjusted the baby's blanket to cover more of its tiny face. The forest pressed in around her, darker and colder than ever. She forced herself to keep moving, even though her body begged her to rest. The ground beneath her was coated with frost, crunching softly under her boots. She winced at the sound. It felt far too loud for the dangerous silence around her. The attackers were somewhere behind her, lost in the maze of trees, but that didn't comfort her. Men like them didn't vanish. They regrouped. They searched. They hunted. And she knew they wouldn't leave the forest until they were sure they had what they came for. Her steps wavered as she moved deeper, navigating the uneven terrain almost blindly. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the growing darkness. Occasionally, a sliver of moonlight cut through the branches, offering her a small path to follow. But most of the time, she moved through pure instinct, guided by the need to protect the baby in her arms. The cold sunk deeper. Her fingertips tingled painfully. Then slowly, frighteningly, the pain faded into numbness. Her lips felt dry and cracked. Her cheeks stung from the wind. She tried to tuck the baby closer, folding herself around the tiny body like a shield. The child's warmth was fading too, and she felt panic crawl into her chest. She couldn't let the cold reach the baby. That was the one thing she could not allow. Her legs finally faltered. She stumbled against a fallen branch and almost went down. She caught herself just in time, but her ankle gave a sharp twist that sent pain shooting up her leg. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, afraid the sound would carry through the woods. She leaned heavily on a nearby tree, her breath shuddering, her body trembling violently from the cold. For a moment she stood there, gripping the rough bark with one hand, her forehead pressed against it. Her heart beat so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She felt dizzy, lightheaded, the edges of her vision blurring. She blinked hard, trying to sharpen her focus. She couldn't collapse. She couldn't fall. The baby's small weight reminded her that giving in was not an option. The child let out a tiny cry, weak and tired. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to break her heart. She shifted her hold, rocking slightly even as she leaned against the tree. "I know," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I know you're cold. I'm trying, sweetheart. Just stay with me." Her voice cracked on the last word. The forest air felt colder, sharp, unforgiving. She pushed herself away from the tree and limped forward again, every step sending pain through her ankle. She ignored it. Pain meant she was still alive, still moving. The baby stirred again, curling closer into her chest, searching for warmth she barely had left to give. She reached a small clearing, just an open patch of ground surrounded by thick brush. It felt exposed, but her body couldn't take another step. She lowered herself slowly onto her knees, holding the baby tight, curling over it as much as she could. The cold rushed up from the ground immediately, biting at her legs. She didn't move away. She couldn't. Her breaths grew shorter. Her arms trembled as she tried to keep them wrapped around the small bundle. She could feel the baby shaking too, tiny tremors against her ribs. She pulled the child even closer, wishing she had more strength, more warmth, more time. The night deepened around her. Her eyelids grew heavy. Her body felt slow, as if the cold were turning her limbs into stone. She knew the danger. She knew what happened to people who stopped moving in the freezing dark. But she couldn't force herself to rise. Not yet. Not when her legs felt like lead and her vision blurred every few seconds. She leaned back against a tree trunk in the clearing, still curled around the baby. Her head drooped forward. She fought it, lifting it again with effort, but it dropped once more. Each breath felt thinner than the last. She could hear her heartbeat slowing, becoming sluggish, struggling against the cold that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She whispered to the baby, though her voice was fading. "I'm here. I won't let go, I promise." The words were barely formed, slipping into the night air as nothing more than a trembling breath. The forest remained silent. She felt her body sinking, the cold numbing everything, stealing sensation, stealing time. She held the baby as tightly as she could, guarding that tiny life with the last bit of warmth she still carried. The night pressed closer, and she drifted between exhaustion and the sharp edge of unconsciousness. Miles away, the world looked entirely different. The forest wasn't a maze of fear to him. It was familiar ground, quiet, steady, predictable. He had ridden through it since he was young, learning every trail, every stream, every patch of wild berries that grew after the rains. He knew the way the wind shifted before a storm. He knew the tracks of deer, the prints of coyotes, and the restless movement of the trees when someone unfamiliar walked among them. And that night, something felt wrong the moment he stepped outside. The wind carried a strange tension, like the forest was holding a secret. The horses in the barn were uneasy, shifting restlessly, snorting at shadows. He ran a hand down the neck of his mare, trying to calm her, but even the gentle gesture didn't settle her nerves. The sky was darkening faster than he expected, clouds sliding in front of the moon like thick smoke. He glanced toward the distant hills and felt an instinctive tug, the same instinct that had saved his life more times than he could count. Something wasn't right out there. He saddled his horse without overthinking it. Some people needed reasons. He trusted his gut. It never lied. By the time he rode out, the cold wind hit him sharp across the face, carrying the scent of frost and damp earth. He leaned forward slightly, urging the horse into a steady pace. The forest branches moved overhead like dark ribbons, and the deeper he went, the more the feeling grew inside him. A quiet pull, a sense of urgency, as if the woods themselves were calling for help. Then he heard it, the faint echo of gunshots. Not loud, not close, but unmistakable. His body tensed immediately. Gunshots at night in these parts rarely meant anything good. He slowed the horse and listened. The forest held its breath. Nothing followed, but the sudden stillness only confirmed his suspicion. Someone was out there, someone in trouble. He started looking for signs, tracks, broken branches, disturbed soil. He didn't need much light to read the forest floor. His eyes had learned long ago to search for what didn't belong. After several minutes, he spotted them, footprints, small and hurried. A woman's by the look of the stride and lighter prints beside hers, barely visible but still present. That meant she carried weight. Maybe a child. His jaw tightened. He dismounted to examine the ground more closely. The prints overlapped with larger ones, heavier boots, at least 3 different sets. They weren't traveling together. The spacing was wrong. The men behind were chasing. He exhaled slowly, his breath clouding the cold air. So that's what this was. He didn't know who she was or why they were after her, but he knew danger when he saw it. And he knew the odds. A woman alone, carrying a child, being hunted through a freezing forest after dark. She didn't stand a chance without help. He followed the trail on foot now, leading his horse by the reins. The uneven terrain made riding risky, and he didn't want to miss the faint signs left behind. The forest was thick, but the tracks were determined, pressed deep into the soil, spaced unevenly like the person had been running, stumbling. He imagined her fear, her desperation, pushing her forward even as exhaustion dragged at her steps. He moved quickly but quietly, scanning the surroundings. After several minutes, he spotted broken branches leading into a denser patch of trees. He crouched down again, touching the snapped wood with his fingertips. Fresh, not more than an hour old. He could almost picture her pushing through it, trying to stay ahead of whoever hunted her. The air grew colder as he moved deeper. The wind whispered through the treetops, nudging clouds over the moon. Shadows stretched and shifted like restless figures. He followed the trail down a narrow slope where the ground turned slippery. He steadied himself against a trunk, testing the footing before guiding his horse down. At the bottom, he found more footprints, scattered in several directions, her trying to confuse them. Clever, but the men had cut through the confusion and continued north. He felt a flicker of respect. She wasn't just running, she was fighting, and that made him even more determined to reach her. He tied his horse to a sturdy branch and continued on foot. The forest thickened until it seemed to swallow the world outside. The darkness pressed closer. He moved through it with ease, stepping over roots, weaving between branches, following the faint markings that someone less trained would have missed entirely. Then he found something that tightened the knot in his chest, a small blanket caught on thorns. He lifted it carefully, feeling how cold the fabric had become. Too cold. A baby must have been wrapped in this little thing not long ago. He scanned the ground again. Her tracks were close together now, almost dragging. She was slowing down, losing strength. He straightened, eyes sharp. She was running out of time. He walked faster, the cold biting through his gloves. The silence grew heavier, pressing against his ears. He listened for any sound, cries, movement, footsteps, but the forest gave him nothing. He paused again, kneeling to examine the next impression. The heel mark was deep, unsteady. She had stumbled here, hard. He swallowed the frustration rising in his chest. He didn't know her, but he could picture the fear in her steps, the weight of the child held tight against her, the breathless urgency of trying to stay alive. Her tracks veered to the right toward a thick cluster of bushes. He followed, pushing through until frost-covered leaves brushed his arms. Beyond them the ground sloped into a small clearing. His breath caught. There, faint but clear, were signs someone had fallen. A knee print, a hand mark, the slight flattening of grass where a body had rested briefly. And next to it, another tiny mark. A baby's foot pressed into the frost for just a moment before being lifted again. She had been here. Cold, exhausted, barely holding on. He stood still, listening. The night wind swept through the clearing in a long, low whistle. Then somewhere far off, he thought he heard something soft, maybe movement, maybe nothing. But he stepped toward it anyway. He followed the trail deeper into the dark, the cold sinking into his bones, the urgency pulsing stronger with each step. Somewhere ahead of him, a woman was fighting to stay alive, and a baby was depending entirely on her. He couldn't turn back now. He wouldn't. He pushed through a thicket of branches, their tips scratching across his coat, and stepped into a quieter part of the forest. The wind felt colder here, the air heavier. Even the trees seemed to be leaning inward, as though holding onto something they didn't want to let go. He paused, listening. At first, he heard nothing but the beating of his own heart. Then faintly, so faintly he almost doubted it, a soft sound drifted through the dark. Not a voice, not a cry, a small, muffled whimper, his breath caught. He turned his head slowly toward the sound, straining to pinpoint its direction. Another breeze passed through the forest, stirring the branches overhead and nearly drowning out the noise. But as soon as the wind settled, it came again, fragile, weak. He followed it, each step slow and deliberate, the cold biting sharply at his cheeks. The ground dipped into a shallow hollow shaded by tall pines. Frost glittered across the leaves like a thin layer of crystal. He walked carefully, lowering himself slightly so he wouldn't miss anything. His eyes scanned the ground, tracing faint tracks, small marks, a disturbed patch of frozen soil. Her steps had grown uneven here. She must have been stumbling. The baby's prints, once barely visible, were gone. She must have held the child tight against her body as the cold grew worse. Then he saw her. She was slumped at the base of a huge tree, her back curved protectively around a small bundle clutched to her chest. Her hair draped across her face in frozen strands. Her arms were wrapped tightly around the baby, her fingers stiff and pale. Frost clung to her coat, turning the fabric into a thin shell of ice. One of her boots lay a few inches from her foot, as if she had lost it while trying to keep moving. She looked almost like part of the forest, still, silent, half covered in winter's breath. For a moment he didn't move. A lump rose in his throat, unexpected and sharp. He had seen hardship before. He had seen people lost to the cold, lost to violence, lost to their own fears. But something about the way she curled her entire body around that tiny life tugged at him with a force he wasn't prepared for. He stepped forward slowly, afraid that even a sound might disturb her fragile state. The closer he got, the more he noticed. The trembling in her shoulders, the way her breaths came faintly, unevenly, like thin threads close to snapping. She was conscious, but barely. Her head lifted slightly when she sensed movement. Her eyes fluttered open halfway, unfocused at first, then locking onto his shape as though she couldn't believe he was real. She tried to speak, but her lips barely moved. No sound came out. He knelt beside her immediately. The cold radiating off her was shocking. He could feel it without even touching her skin. She had been in the freezing air for too long, far too long. His eyes moved to the baby in her arms. The child was wrapped tightly, face pressed against her chest. Tiny breaths clouded the air, slow but steady. Alive. She had saved the baby with the last bit of warmth left in her body. He reached out gently, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. Her pulse was faint, but it was there. Relief washed over him, but it brought urgency with it. She didn't have much time, not in this cold, not in her condition. He whispered softly, leaning closer so she could hear him. "You're safe now. I've got you. I'm going to get you both out of here." Her eyes softened, as if just hearing another human voice gave her permission to let go of the tension she'd held for hours. A tear slipped down her cheek, freezing almost instantly on her skin. He worked quickly, removing his thick coat and wrapping it around her shoulders without shifting the baby from her hold. Then he added his scarf, tucking it around the child to trap as much heat as possible. His fingers moved with urgency but gentleness. He knew that sudden warmth could be dangerous, so he handled her carefully, keeping her movement minimal. "Stay with me," he murmured, touching her cheek lightly. "Just hang on a little longer." She blinked slowly, trying to keep her eyes open. Her breath trembled as she exhaled. She wasn't fully present anymore, somewhere between awareness and fading consciousness. But she held the baby tighter, even in her weakness. Her instincts didn't sleep, even when her body begged to. He lifted her into his arms, adjusting her position so the baby stayed warm between them. She was lighter than he expected. Too light. Cold had a way of stripping strength until a person became just bones and breath. He stood with her carefully, bracing himself against the cold wind that swept through the clearing. His horse was too far to bring to her, so he moved as quickly as he could without jarring her fragile state. The forest seemed darker now, the path more uncertain, but he walked with steady determination, guided by instinct and urgency. The woman stirred weakly in his arms, her voice barely a breath. "Please, the baby." It was all she managed before her head fell against his shoulder. He swallowed hard, tightening his grip. "I've got the baby," he answered softly. "Both of you are safe now." Branches brushed his shoulders as he pushed through the trees, his breath coming out in white bursts. He didn't look back. The danger behind them didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was getting her warm, getting the baby somewhere safe, keeping those fragile breaths going. He followed the faint path that led back toward his horse, every step heavy with responsibility. The forest seemed to close in around them, but he didn't falter, not with her life depending on him. Not with the baby's soft breaths reminding him how close they had come to losing everything. The night remained cold. The wind cut through the trees with a hollow cry, but he kept going, because he had found them, and now getting them home was the only thing that mattered.